The canvas flaps rattled against the steel frame of the GMC truck as it lurched over potholes carved into the Norman mud. The air smelled of wet earth, cordite, and the faint sweetness of gasoline that seemed to cling to every American vehicle. Gefreiter Karl Metzger sat hunched with a dozen other prisoners, their gray field uniforms streaked with soot from the hedgerow fighting that had swallowed their regiment. He clutched his dented M35 helmet to his chest as if it might still protect him, though his rifle was gone, and the Reich he had sworn to defend now seemed distant, even mythical. The convoy groaned forward, one truck among hundreds. Through a gap in the canvas, Karl watched a sight that unsettled him more than capture itself. The road was alive with American machines. Jeeps darted past with radios jutting from their rears. Engineers guided bulldozers that dragged prefabricated bridges toward the front, and endless lines of olive-drab trucks carried barrels marked "Fuel, 80 octane." The numbers defied imagination. In Germany, each liter of petrol was rationed like gold. Officers barked at mechanics for wasting drops during refueling. Here, the road itself seemed paved with fuel. The truck jolted to a halt near a crossroads. Karl lifted the canvas flap fully now, unable to resist the spectacle. A column of armored vehicles rolled past, their engines drowning out the rain. He recognized the silhouette of the American Sherman, boxy and high-turreted, its white star stark against the mud. One tank passed, then another, then 10 more, each escorted by support vehicles hauling spare tracks, crates of ammunition, even whole replacement engines. In his division, every damaged Panther had been stripped of parts like vultures on a carcass. The Americans, it seemed, carried replacements as casually as they carried rations. The numbers lodged in Karl's mind like shrapnel. He would learn later, through rumors whispered in the cages, that America had built nearly 50,000 of these Shermans, while Germany had produced just over 6,000 Panthers. Even now, as a captive, he could sense the imbalance. The clatter of American tracks was not the sound of superior design. It was the sound of inexhaustible supply. The rain thickened, soaking through the canvas until drops struck his helmet with hollow taps. His seatmate, an older corporal, muttered about humiliation and dishonor. But Karl could only stare at the procession and whisper words that surprised even him. "They have more machines than we have men." As the convoy crested a ridge, the valley below unfolded like an apocalyptic vision. Hundreds of vehicles stretched into the horizon, headlights cutting through the rain, engines growling in mechanical unison. To Karl, it looked less like an army and more like an entire nation on the move, an industrial tide carrying rifles, bombs, and bridges. He realized then that the true enemy was not the men in uniforms, but the factories, farms, and shipyards across the ocean that had made this flood possible. The truck rattled downhill toward the Valley of Steel, and Karl felt the weight of inevitability press upon him. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows like gauze as Private Joe Ramirez leaned against the hull of his Sherman, listening to the cough of engines coming alive one by one. The tanks lined the orchard in neat rows, dew glistening on their olive-drab armor. Mechanics darted among them, checking tracks and topping off fuel cans. Joe pulled his tanker's helmet over his ears and slapped the turret affectionately, calling it by the name his crew had painted on the barrel, Rosita. The Sherman was no marvel of engineering compared to the Panthers and Tigers whispered about by infantrymen. Joe knew its armor was thinner, its 75-millimeter gun less powerful. The Germans called it a Ronson, after the lighter that always lit on the first try, a cruel reference to how quickly it could catch fire when pierced. Yet Ramirez carried no fear in his tone when he joked with his crew. For every Sherman lost, another waited on a beachhead or in a ship's hold. America had built over 49,000 of them. He didn't need to outmatch the Germans tank for tank. He needed only to endure until the next one arrived. Inside, the tank smelled of oil, canvas, and sweat. Joe squeezed into the gunner's seat as the commander called them to move out. The orchard erupted with sound, 30-ton machines grinding forward, treads chewing the damp earth. Civilians peeked from shattered cottages, their eyes wide as the column thundered past. Joe imagined what it must look like to them, a steel tide advancing inexorably through farmland once ruled by German patrols. The platoon reached a crossroads where a Panther lay smoldering, its crew gone. Joe studied the blackened hulk, noting the long barrel and thick glacis plate. On paper, the Panther should have dominated his Sherman, but war was not mathematics. It was logistics. That tank had run out of fuel the day before. Now it was nothing more than a burned carcass blocking traffic. Joe's Sherman rolled past with a full tank, extra jerry cans strapped to the hull, and crates of shells piled in the support truck behind him. As dusk settled, the column halted in a ruined village. Ramirez climbed out, stretching his legs. He watched a replacement Sherman being unloaded from a transport convoy already pulling in behind them. A fresh tank, already fueled, painted, and ready for battle, as though war were a factory line. He grinned at the absurdity of it. Germany could name every Panther by serial number. America rolled Shermans out faster than he could remember their nicknames. The engines of the convoy hummed through the night, a lullaby of inevitability. The hospital tent glowed against the dusk like a lantern, its canvas walls shivering with every gust of wind. Captain Ellen Foster pushed through the flap, her boots sinking into straw meant to soak up the blood. The smell inside was a mixture of antiseptic, sweat, and iron, heavy enough to choke a novice. But Foster moved with practiced calm, her apron already stained with the day's work. Rows of stretchers filled the space, American boys groaning as medics cut away uniforms. The steady clink of plasma bottles accompanied their cries, tubes running like lifelines into pale arms. Crates stamped Medical Corps, U.S. Army were stacked to the ceiling, overflowing with morphine syrettes, sulfa packets, and rolls of gauze. She had grown accustomed to the abundance, but tonight, German POWs lay among the wounded, and their wide eyes betrayed disbelief. One young prisoner, no older than 17, flinched as a nurse dabbed iodine on his shrapnel wound. "So much," he whispered in halting English, staring at the shelves of supplies. Ellen understood. In Europe, hospitals had been stripped bare by bombing and rationing. Germany recycled bandages and rationed morphine. Here in Normandy, American doctors tossed used dressings into heaps without thought. As Ellen adjusted a plasma drip, she thought of the scale that sustained her work. By 1944, America had produced over 1.5 million units of plasma, an impossible number for a nation that had been at peace only 3 years earlier. Factories in New Jersey and Chicago packaged lifeblood as efficiently as bombers or tanks, and now it flowed into the veins of men who would otherwise have perished. Outside, the drone of trucks never ceased. Convoys delivered not just ammunition but entire hospitals, with tents, generators, and surgical tools shipped in bulk. Ellen's unit had erected a functioning surgical ward in a field that days before had been scarred by artillery. She could almost forget the mud beneath her boots. So complete was the illusion of permanence. The German youth grabbed her wrist as she turned away. His voice cracked as he said, "Even your wounded are rich." Ellen did not answer. She could not explain that this wealth was not born of cruelty, but of democracy's ability to mobilize. She simply patted his hand, then moved on to the next soldier, another face pale under the lantern light. The cries of the wounded blended with the rustle of supplies being unpacked. For every bandage used, another waited in a crate. The rhythm was inexhaustible, and Ellen worked until dawn, carried by it like a current. The air in Berlin was heavy with coal smoke and fear. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, sat hunched over production tables illuminated by the weak light of a desk lamp. Reports from the front were dire. Normandy breached, the Allies surging inland, but it was the numbers in front of him that carved the deepest wound. On paper, Germany had increased tank output despite Allied bombing. Factories scattered across forests and mountains turned out Panthers and Tigers, each meticulously built, each a monument to engineering. Yet the figures paled beside the Allied reports he could not ignore. In April 1944, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan had produced 453 B-24 Liberators in 468 hours, one bomber an hour, more in a month than all German aircraft industries combined. Speer rubbed his temples. The Reich had prided itself on quality, aircraft like the Me-262 jet, tanks with unmatched armor and guns. But numbers told another truth. Quality could not replace mass. The Americans had built 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Germany barely managed 39,000. Their factories were fed by unbroken supply lines of oil, steel, and labor, while his workshops starved for materials and lived under the constant threat of bombing raids. He thought of Hitler's faith in wonder weapons. Rockets and jet fighters might terrify, but they could not alter the arithmetic of war. And Me-262 was useless without trained pilots or fuel. Meanwhile, America trained thousands of aviators, fueled their aircraft with oil from Texas, and replaced losses in weeks. A telegram lay open on his desk, describing Big Week earlier that year when 500 American bombers had been lost attacking German aircraft plants. Speer knew the true disaster was not the losses inflicted on the Americans, but their ability to shrug them off. 8,000 planes had rolled off American assembly lines in that same month. German factories could never dream of such resilience. He rose from his chair and gazed out at Berlin, lights blacked out against Allied bombers. In that silence, he felt the inevitability of defeat pressing in like a physical weight. He would later admit in his memoirs, "We had lost the war when the first 15,000 American aircraft came off the assembly line." The lamp flickered. Speer closed the reports, but the numbers would not leave him. They hung in the air like a verdict, unanswerable, final. The February sky above Germany was streaked with white contrails, layer upon layer until the sun itself seemed veiled. The roar of engines shook windows across Leipzig as American bombers pressed their attack during what would later be called Big Week. In his cockpit, Luftwaffe ace Heinz Bremer squinted into the glare. The formations were unlike anything he had seen in the early years of the war. Dozens had become hundreds, and hundreds now became thousands. Each B-17 and B-24 lumbered forward in tight combat boxes, their .50 caliber guns glinting like teeth. Behind them, swarms of P-51 Mustangs waited to pounce. Bremer dove into the formation, his 20mm cannon spitting fire. He saw one Liberator lurch, smoke trailing from an engine, then spiral earthward. But for every bomber falling, 10 more droned on, steady, relentless. By day's end, the Americans would lose 500 heavy bombers, entire crews vanishing in fire and smoke. It should have been a German victory, but Bremer sensed no triumph. Intelligence reports soon reached him. In February 1944 alone, the United States had produced 8,000 new aircraft. The losses, staggering by human measure, were statistically irrelevant. Factories in Kansas, Michigan, and California were already rolling replacements off the line. He thought of his own training. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots received only a fraction of the flight hours he had enjoyed. Fuel shortages kept aircraft grounded. Bremer knew boys barely out of flight school who were sent against these massive formations with only a dozen hours in the cockpit. The Americans flew with thousands of hours of collective experience, guided by radar and navigation gear mass-produced in laboratories untouched by war. Below, bombs rained down on aircraft plants in Regensburg and Leipzig, smashing assembly halls and burning warehouses. The Reich's capacity to produce fighters dwindled with every strike. And yet, by the following week, the bombers were back, more of them than before, their numbers unending. When Bremer landed, his aircraft riddled with holes, he stood on the tarmac, listening to the silence around him. The squadron had returned with barely half its strength. His commander clapped him on the shoulder, but Bremer could not lift his head. "They are like a river," he muttered, "a river that never dries." The night convoy stretched across France like glowing arteries, headlights dimmed but unbroken, the hum of engines weaving into a mechanical hymn. It was August 25th, 1944, and the Red Ball Express had begun its ceaseless journey. Private James Williams gripped the wheel of his GMC CCKW truck, eyes fixed on the dim taillights ahead. Behind him were tons of gasoline, shells, and rations, all that Patton's Third Army needed to keep moving east. The road itself had been closed to all but military traffic, marked by red circles painted on signs. The Red Ball. Williams was one of thousands of African-American drivers who kept the lifeline open. Mud splashed his windshield, and the stench of diesel filled the cabin. He barely noticed anymore. Fatigue was constant, sleep rare. Yet he pressed on, knowing that if his convoy halted, tanks at the front would run dry. In 3 months, the Red Ball Express would move over 412,000 tons of supplies using more than 6,000 trucks daily. The numbers bordered on fantasy, but Williams lived them each mile. Every clattering gear shift, every refueled Sherman, every delivered ration box was proof of America's industrial reach. At a prisoner cage along the roadside, German captives pressed against the wire, watching the convoys thunder past. Karl Metzger stood among them, mud still on his boots from St. Lo. He counted trucks until he lost track, each one stacked high with fuel drums or ammunition crates. His comrade whispered, "They cannot run out." Karl answered softly, "They do not even know how to." Where Germany relied on horse-drawn wagons for much of its transport, the Americans turned highways into weapons. Tires, engines, spare parts. Everything flowed in such abundance that the system became a moving factory. If a truck broke down, another took its place. If a bridge collapsed, engineers built one overnight. Williams drove through dawn into another night, convoy stretching as far as he could see. He didn't fight with a rifle, yet his work crushed the enemy just as surely. Each gallon he delivered kept a Sherman moving. Each box of rations gave strength to infantrymen pressing forward. Karl watched until the horizon swallowed the last truck. "This is not an army," he murmured. "It is an industry with rifles." The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a frozen labyrinth. Trees heavy with snow, roads iced over until they gleamed like glass. In the early days of the German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Tank Commander Oberleutnant Franz Ritter ordered his Panther forward, its 75mm gun ready, its crew hungry for the breakthrough promised by Hitler himself. Yet within hours, Ritter found his machine powerless, not from enemy fire, but from an empty fuel gauge. His crew siphoned petrol from abandoned half-tracks, funneling precious drops into the tank's yawning throat. Civilians' wagons were seized, their barrels emptied into German machines. It was desperation, not strategy. The Reich's synthetic fuel plants, once capable of sustaining operations, now produced less than 10% of their 1941 output. Allied bombers had reduced them to rubble. Ritter's Panther, formidable on paper, was reduced to a pillbox in the snow. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lines, American tankers like Joe Ramirez pressed forward with fuel drums strapped to their Shermans. Convoys from the Red Ball Express delivered gasoline by the thousands of gallons, each truck running day and night. When one stalled, another replaced it without hesitation. The difference was not courage, but supply, and Ritter knew it. At a crossroads near St. Vith, Ritter's tank finally sputtered and died. The crew abandoned it, removing the breech block so the gun couldn't be salvaged. Ritter lingered long enough to hear the distant growl of approaching Shermans, the sound of an army moving because it could. He knew then that the battle was already lost, no matter how fierce the counterattack. Later, American GIs stumbled upon the abandoned Panther, noting the missing parts. To them, it was proof of German ingenuity, but also futility. A war machine without fuel was nothing but frozen steel. The Ardennes was supposed to be Germany's last great gamble, but without oil, it became a graveyard of stranded armor. For every Panther left behind, dozens of Shermans rolled forward, engines warm, tanks refueled by a logistical miracle stretching back to Normandy's beaches. Ritter's men trudged into the snow, rifles slung low, their once proud tank now a monument to scarcity. The forest echoed with the mechanical certainty of American advance. The POW camp in northern France was nothing more than barbed wire strung across muddy fields, but to Karl Metzger, it felt like another planet. On his second night, he crouched near the fence line and watched American guards unwrap their rations. The smell of coffee drifted on the cold air, mingling with the sharp tang of diesel from idling trucks. One guard pulled a chocolate bar from a K-ration box, took a few bites, then tossed the rest aside. Another discarded an unopened tin of cheese spread. The sight made Karl's chest tighten. In Germany, his family boiled turnips until the pot crusted over, ration cards spent on gray bread that crumbled like dust. He had seen wounded men in his unit trading medals for a spoonful of jam, and here the Americans threw food away as though it were nothing. The K-ration itself was a marvel. Neatly packed boxes containing biscuits, meat tins, powdered coffee, even chewing gum. The U.S. had produced 20 billion of them during the war. Karl would later learn that American quartermasters considered them expendable, better to waste than to risk shortage. But to him, crouched in the mud, the waste was a kind of sorcery. One evening, a guard noticed the prisoners eyeing the scraps and tossed an entire unopened box over the wire. Karl caught it, heart pounding. Inside, he found biscuits, candy, and a packet of powdered lemon drink. He divided the contents among his comrades but pocketed the chocolate. That night, under the stars, he let a square melt slowly on his tongue. It was sweeter than anything he had tasted since boyhood. The irony gnawed at him. German propaganda had promised that the Reich's discipline and sacrifice would outlast the enemy's decadence. Yet here was proof of the opposite. America's abundance was so great, it bordered on careless. Even the wounded received plasma, morphine, and cigarettes in quantities Karl could hardly believe. He realized then that scarcity itself was Germany's greatest enemy. In the weeks that followed, he saw guards burning stacks of surplus cardboard boxes simply to clear space. To Karl, each flame was a reminder that the Reich had been defeated not just in battlefields, but in warehouses and factories oceans away. He clutched his chocolate bar like treasure, whispering to himself, "This alone could buy loyalty at home." On the screen of a makeshift projector in the Iowa POW camp, newsreel footage flickered to life. Karl Metzger leaned forward, eyes straining. The camera panned across a vast building filled with workers, men and women in coveralls, sparks flying from welders' torches, engines hoisted onto assembly lines. The narrator's voice boomed, "Ford's Willow Run plant produces a B-24 Liberator every hour." Karl's breath caught. He watched wings slide into fuselages, riveters clambering across half-built bombers, rows of propellers gleaming under factory lights. The camera pulled back to reveal an entire squadron rolling off the line in formation, ready for flight. In a single month, more aircraft had been built here than Germany's entire industry could muster. The POWs muttered among themselves. One shook his head in disbelief, another laughed bitterly. They had imagined American factories, but nothing like this. Germany's plants were hidden in forests, production scattered in small workshops, constantly under bombardment. At Willow Run, Thousands of workers labored in heated halls, assembly lines stretching farther than the eye could follow. Carl thought of his father, who had worked 12-hour shifts in a Munich workshop assembling aircraft parts by hand. Bombings had shattered their neighborhood, forcing production into underground tunnels. Tools were scarce, workers exhausted. By contrast, the Americans seemed to swim in raw material, their conveyor belts feeding a machine that never stopped. The numbers were incomprehensible. In 1944, the U.S. built 96,318 aircraft. Germany produced less than half. For every Panther tank painstakingly assembled, 10 Shermans rolled off American lines. The newsreel showed crates of supplies, fuel drums stacked like hay bales, trains and ships loading equipment bound for Europe. The narrator's tone was triumphant, but for Carl it was something darker, a revelation that defeat had been inevitable. The Reich's soldiers had fought bravely, but bravery could not conjure tanks, fuel, or aircraft from rubble. Watching those gleaming bombers roll out by the hour, he whispered the words that had haunted him since St. Lo. We never stood a chance. The reel ended, lights flickering back on. Carl sat in silence, the images burned into his memory. For the first time, he understood that the war had been decided not in the hedgerows of Normandy or the snows of Russia, but in factories thousands of miles away. Inside the Allied headquarters at Versailles, the war was reduced to columns of numbers chalked across blackboards. Generals and staff officers pored over graphs as if they were battle maps. Supply charts replaced terrain contours. Production schedules dictated strategy as much as troop movements. To Karl Metzger, watching this world later from the perspective of captivity, it seemed absurd that war could be fought with pencils and ledgers. But here was proof. Numbers themselves had become weapons. The arithmetic was devastating in its simplicity. The United States had lost 36,000 aircraft in combat during the war. On its own, that figure seemed catastrophic. Yet the same reports revealed that America had built nearly 300,000 in total. Each loss, however tragic, was a grain of sand against a mountain. The Reich could not match that mountain. Its entire wartime production amounted to fewer than 120,000 aircraft. Charts of tank losses told the same story. By late 1944, American divisions in Europe fielded waves of M4 Shermans. A single month's production of Shermans, upward of 2,000 machines, exceeded Germany's entire stock of Panthers. Loss ratios no longer carried the meaning they once had. Even if a Panther destroyed 3 Shermans, the arithmetic favored the Americans. Another Sherman, and then another, was always on the way. One staff officer joked grimly to a correspondent that the United States did not fight a war of attrition, but a war of replacement. What the Germans saw as waste, the Americans saw as insurance. Bombers lost in daylight raids were replaced in weeks. Rifles broken in the Ardennes were swapped from warehouses bursting with spares. Even men themselves, young recruits drawn from farms, cities, and factories, arrived by the tens of thousands, trained and equipped with a uniformity that stunned observers. For the Germans, every destroyed Panther was a national calamity. Each fighter aircraft lost a wound that could not heal. For the Americans, each loss was absorbed, filed, and replaced. Numbers were not abstract. They were as real as artillery shells and armor plating. When the figures were briefed to visiting officers, one colonel tapped the board with his pipe and said flatly, "We will bury them in numbers." The phrase stuck in Carl's mind when he heard it repeated by other prisoners. It was not arrogance, it was mathematics. The chalk on the board spelled out Germany's defeat as clearly as any battlefield. The war had shifted from duels of men and machines to duels of output, and in that duel, America was invincible. On an Iowa farm, wheat bent under the summer wind as a young woman signed her paycheck from the local munitions plant. In Detroit, riveters finished their shift. sparks flying from the bellies of half-built bombers. In California, shipyard cranes hoisted Liberty ship hulls into the water at the rate of one a day. The arsenal of democracy stretched across a continent, every field, workshop, and factory bound to the front lines. 18 million Americans worked in defense industries by 1944, 6 million of them women. They wore coveralls instead of dresses, helmets instead of hats, wielding tools once considered the domain of men. Rosie the Riveter was no abstraction. She was the neighbor, the sister, the wife. Each rivet driven into aluminum skin was as vital as a bullet fired in Normandy. War bonds covered kitchen tables. Ration cards measured sugar and meat, and victory gardens sprouted in every town. It was a national mobilization, unlike any in history, and it dwarfed the efforts of the totalitarian states it opposed. Germany enslaved laborers to fill its factories. America relied on volunteers answering a democratic call. The difference infused every product rolling off the lines. Workers knew they were not building for a dictator's dream, but for their brothers, fathers, and sons fighting overseas. Captain Ellen Foster, writing a letter home from Normandy, tried to capture the feeling, "We are never short of anything. Plasma, bandages, medicine. I think of the hands that packed each crate, and I know someone cared enough to send it right." Her words echoed the truth that abundance was not accident, but intention. The production numbers astonished even military planners. In a single year, the United States launched nearly 40,000 aircraft, built 49,000 Shermans, and turned out a Liberty ship in less time than it took to paint its name on the bow. Every statistic seemed impossible, yet the evidence was tangible on every battlefield. Prisoners like Carl realized that the factories were the true front lines. Their defeat had been sealed not only in the mud of Russia or the sands of Africa, but in the clang of Detroit steel presses and the hum of Iowa assembly lines. America's strength came not from centuries of martial tradition, but from the collective will of ordinary citizens. Ellen's letter closed with a line that spoke for millions. "We will win not just because of our men, but because of our people." Years after the war, Karl Metzger walked with his son through a rebuilt German town, its streets humming with commerce again. He carried memories he rarely spoke of, but one evening as they passed a shop window filled with American goods, he paused. His son tugged at his sleeve, asking what it had been like to face the Americans. Karl stared into the glass and saw not soldiers, but convoys, tanks, and factories rolling endlessly from his past. He told the boy of the night he saw convoys of trucks on French roads, headlights stretching to the horizon. Of the chocolate bar he once held like treasure. Of the newsreel showing bombers rolling from Willow Run every hour. "We thought we fought their soldiers," he said softly. "But in truth, we fought their factories." The statistics still staggered him. 96,000 aircraft in 1944, 49,000 Shermans built, more ships than Germany could ever sink. Numbers so vast they felt unreal, yet he had lived their consequences in mud and captivity. Germany's bravery had been real, but bravery could not conjure fuel from dry wells or bread from empty fields. Against America's abundance, the Reich had never stood a chance. For Americans, that abundance had never been mere luxury. It was the price of freedom, paid in sweat on assembly lines and blood on battlefields. Each rivet, each shell, each crate of plasma tied home front to front line in an unbreakable chain. Industrial democracy had proven stronger than dictatorship's discipline, generosity more enduring than scarcity. Karl's voice faltered as he told his son, "Even in our defeat, I respected them." They built freedom in their factories as surely as they won it on the beaches. His son looked up at him, wide-eyed, as though hearing a fable. Yet Karl knew it was truth, etched into history as deeply as any battle. The legacy remained not just in statistics, but in the world reshaped by victory. American abundance had dismantled tyranny and preserved democracy. The arsenal of democracy had not only armed soldiers, it had defined an era, proving that free people, properly equipped and determined, could overcome any tyranny. The memory of convoys and bombers lingered with Carl until his last days, an echo of inevitability. He had fought bravely, but the war had been lost the moment he glimpsed that valley of steel near St. Lo.